What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of the Terminator Training Show. I'm Kevin Smith. I am back in my house recording this episode after a great trip to California to visit some family and enjoy life a little bit on the West Coast. Did a bunch of hiking and walking and seeing family. Saw both of my nephews on my wife's side of the family, so that my in-laws, for their first birthday, they were born like 3 days apart. And then also my mother-in-law's birthday was on the end of the last week, her 60th birthday. So we celebrated those. Nice little convenient week. Go out there and celebrate all of their birthdays and also enjoy California. I also have one of my uncles and some of my cousins out there. So unfortunately, we were only able to meet up with the uncle for dinner at a great Mexican spot. But it was always nice to see him. He's my dad's oldest brother. And I actually see him more often than most of my uncles because he happens to live out where I have other family. And so we see him more frequently than most of my other uncles who live, and most of my other family, to be honest, who live up in New England. So great trip, back on the grind. And we are here today with a Q&A episode with yesterday's Q&A Instagram questions. I am going to get to some that I didn't get to on Instagram stories, and I'll also do some that I also answered on Instagram, just more in depth. I'm going to try to get to a lot of them and just keep the answers concise, but you guys who have been listening for a while know how sometimes that goes. Sometimes I only get to fewer questions just because they require more nuance, and that's totally fine. But keep asking your questions. If I don't get to them, it's not because I'm just ignoring them, just a volume thing, trying to get to as many as I can. But at the same time, either keep asking them, or maybe if it's been a few weeks at a time and I haven't answered it, probably improve the quality of the question or improve the wording or something like that. And I should be able to give you a better answer, because some questions just either are repeat questions that I get all the time, and or they are questions that are just, not very contextual and low effort. And therefore I usually don't even put any effort into the answer, other than sometimes I like to give facetious and sarcastic answers, which you guys have probably heard before, but that's just me having fun, nothing personal, and I enjoy it. So let's hop into today's questions. First question: would you recommend running your new run program alongside the hypertrophy program? Not necessarily. That sounds like a little bit excessive. Programs in general are supposed to be followed just one program. The hypertrophy program, the 19-week hypertrophy program, is a relatively high volume compared to some hypertrophy programs. It's, I would say, moderate volume, but it is definitely enough to take a good amount of your mental and physical fatigue and recovery reserves throughout the week. And if you were to also run the run program, so I'm assuming you're saying that you're just going to do the run part of the run program and not the lifts and the lifts in the hypertrophy program. That wouldn't be very smart. That would be way too much. But that is what I'm assuming that you're saying, because there is lifting in the running program. It would still be a little bit too much because the running is also relatively intense and high intensity. A lot of it is. So I highly doubt that would be optimal for your ability to recover. You would probably maybe make some gains, at least for a little while, but I think it would just be a little bit too much for most people, given the fact that most people are not very dialed in with their recovery outside the gym. And even if you were, it still might be a little bit too much. You would be, regardless, if you do choose to do this, you would be sacrificing some run gains. You'd be sacrificing some strength gains and hypertrophy gains at the very best. That would be like kind of the best case scenario. So a worst case scenario, you would just overdo it, or you would get injured, or you would just be super fatigued all the time and really frustrated and probably overtrain. So wouldn't recommend it. Last episode, I had a question about following my run program, but just the base phase along with one of my lifting programs, and that's fine. But that's just the base phase. And if you want to do that with a hypertrophy program, you absolutely can, because base building, when done properly, is very low fatigue, very low effort, because it's mostly just slow running, almost all just slow running. And for running, intensity is going to be more fatiguing than volume, and vice versa. For lifting, usually volume is more fatiguing than intensity, but that would just be a little bit too much for most people in most cases. So I would recommend against it. But again, the run program has lifting in it. So although you're not going to get super crazy jacked on it, you're not going to lose a whole lot of strength, if any. Some people, if you're newer and you are more susceptible to gains, you very well may gain strength and muscle on it, but it is definitely enough to sustain your muscle mass and your strength, so long as you are good outside the gym and you recover well and you eat plenty of food and you stick to the intensity and volume parameters of the program. So that would be my recommendation. Yo, when are we getting the shirts and hats, bro? I actually have a shirt on right now. Represent. All right, so this is something that is eventually probably going to happen, but right now I just don't have the bandwidth for it. I have a lot going on, and making shirts and hats and whatever else, believe it or not, takes definitely some time and some effort and some thought. But at the same time, I think it would be a really good idea to put hats and shirts for sale. It just hasn't been quite up at the top of the list of priorities yet. So expect them to occur, I would say, in the next year, maybe 18 months. But I wouldn't expect them much sooner than, a couple months. So that would be my best. I'm glad that people are asking for them and excited for them and they want them. That's awesome. And, if I get more inquiries and more people asking about them and wanting them, then maybe I'll expedite it a little bit and do it a little sooner. But yeah, doing my best, but I wouldn't expect it like tomorrow or next week, maybe a little bit down the road. Next question, is it true that most naturals maxed out their genetic muscle potential if they built 35 to 45 pounds of muscle? So I think he's asking, like, after you've built, like, how much muscle could a natural potentially build if they max out their genetic potential throughout a lifetime of training? And natural meaning no PEDs. And we'll just talk like average genetics. Not some people have very, very extreme elite genetics and they could build way more than this. But I would say for average genetics, it really, really does depend not just on your genetics. It depends on how consistent you are, how hard you train, how sound your training programming is, what your goals are. Depends on what you do outside the gym, your lifestyle, your sleep, your nutrition, your stress management. So it depends on lots and lots of different things. We'll assume that all that stuff is pretty good to like really good, which is very rare. Not a lot of people are following really good programs. Not a lot of people are super dialed in outside the gym. Not a lot of people train really, really consistently. Not a lot of people train hard. Not a lot of people use really good form. So assuming you're one of the people that are, in that small category of people who live that way and live that way, I would say 35 to 45 pounds, maybe 40 to 50 would be a more realistic range. But at the same time, like I said, it just depends on so many different factors. If you have really good genetics, you definitely could gain 50 plus pounds of muscle, maybe even 60. But those people are very rare. They're not super common. But also, even if you don't have great genetics, but you're just way more dialed in than a lot of people who do have great genetics, which is oftentimes the case, you could outgain someone like that. Most people never reach anywhere near their genetic potential when it comes to muscle growth or really any fitness discipline, because it takes a lot of hard work, not just training, but outside the gym too. And that's the hardest part for a lot of people. So I would say, regardless of where you're at, continue working. And I wouldn't really cap yourself out on a specific amount of like, there's no way in hell I'm going to gain any more muscle. Say you've hit that top end of the range, which I said was about 50. If you just believe that you're done gaining muscle no matter what, and regardless of what you do, you're not going to gain any more muscle, then you're probably not going to gain any more muscle. But you could probably gain a pound of muscle over the next year, maybe 2 years with everything dialed in, and boom, you're over the top of the range. So a lot of people, when they reach what they think is their genetic potential, but probably isn't, a lot of people go on PEDs, whether it's a very haphazard PED cycle or something like TRT. TRT is definitely PEDs, absolutely, because you have exogenous testosterone. But if you do it right and you have doctor prescription and you go about it the proper way and you monitor your labs and take care of your health and you don't just use TRT as a Band-Aid, it actually can be really good for some people. Having really low T is not a good thing at all for your health. And it's way worse for you to have low T than it is to have like moderate to high normal T, even if that is exogenous, assuming everything else, all of your other lifestyle factors are in check and you're not just using it for a Band-Aid. So a lot of people will go on that well before they hit their genetic potential. So they never really know what their genetic potential was for muscle growth, which I'm not here to tell you is wrong or bad or anything like that. You can live your life however you want. A lot of people will go on way more PEDs than TRT and potentially put their health at risk. But either way, regardless of whether you hit your genetic potential, regardless of what that range may be, if you continue to work at it, continue to train, continue to put the effort in, continue to do the right things outside the gym, sleep well, eat well, and manage your stress well, there's no reason that you couldn't continue growing muscle at least to a certain age, most likely. If you've been lifting your entire life and you're 55, 60 years old, you're probably not going to build a hell of a lot more muscle unless you take a bunch of time off and then you start lifting again. But if you've been doing it consistently, you're probably past that stage, unless, of course, you go on exogenous testosterone. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't lift, because otherwise you're going to start losing muscle, and losing muscle is not good at all. Muscle mass is very pro-longevity. It's probably muscle mass and strength are probably the two biggest things that will predict your lifespan, and also most importantly your health span. So lifespan is how long you live, health span is how long you live in a way that is healthy and you enjoy life. So basically you want to die really, really quickly instead of get to a certain age and then die over 25 years, because modern medicine is keeping you alive. So I would much rather personally live to 90, but only spend like 2 years dying. So be really, really healthy and really enjoy my life until 88, then live to 97, but spend the last 20 years of my life dying. And when you lift consistently and you've built lots of muscle and lots of strength throughout your entire life, and you continue to maintain it at least slow down the rate of loss, you have a better chance of living that long than, 77, 77 is actually the life expectancy of most men, I believe, in the average man in the United States. So more like 50. Most people start dying at like 50, 55, and they die for 20, 25 years, and modern medicine keeps them alive, but the quality of life is terrible. So either way, keep lifting, keep trying, and don't worry too much about the range. But I would say 40 to 50 pounds is usually pretty realistic. Next question, what is the most underrated exercise for SFAS prep? I don't really think there's one single underrated exercise, and I really don't think that even if there was, it wouldn't be the same for everyone. The most underrated exercise for each person is probably the exercise that makes them better at the thing that they are weakest at. So if you're weak at rucking's probably underrated for you and you should do more of it. If you're weak at running's probably underrated and you should do more of it. If you're not very strong in the gym, lifting weights is underrated for you and you should get stronger. Most people have like certain strengths in the gym and other weaknesses. So whatever brings up those other weaknesses to make you less weak in that area is going to be underrated for you. But a lot of people do neglect certain things. A lot of people, either by choice or just because they aren't executing movements correctly, neglect certain parts of the body. A lot of times it's the upper back. The upper back's super important. That is your rhomboids, your traps, a little bit to a lesser extent, your rear delts. A lot of people don't train that properly, and they do a lot of lat work. They turn a lot of rows into lat exercises by kind of keeping their elbows tucked, and they don't really allow that beefy upper back to grow. And if you think about it, that is what connects you to your ruck. So you really want an beefy upper back, really, really strong, really muscular upper back, because it's going to make rucking, which is going to be miserable and painful and uncomfortable either way, but it's going to make it less so when you have very well-developed upper back muscles. Additionally, hamstrings, I would say, maybe even to a lesser extent glutes, but a lot of times hamstrings. A lot of people have major quad dominance, and when you have very, very dominant quads, it can be a recipe for knee issues and other injuries like that. Not quite as much of a factor for a longer, slower endurance stuff. Definitely a factor for running fast and sprints and stuff like that. If you have much stronger quads than your hamstrings, then it can absolutely put you at risk, like running sprints for a hamstring tear or something like that. But definitely focus on your hamstrings. Definitely focus on your lower legs as well. Your tibialis, your calves. I would say those are pretty underrated movements for people who are rucking and running a lot, doing properly executed calf raises with a long stretch at the bottom, driving your toes up to your shins when you're in that bottom position, and then vice versa. Also training the other side of the leg with tibialis raises, ideally weighted if you can. Those would be very, very good exercises to do for anyone training for selection, because your lower legs are just going to take a pounding. So Again, I wouldn't say there's a single exercise that's underrated, but I would choose exercises based on what your weaknesses are. Obviously, there are some exercises that everyone should absolutely do: ruck, run, lift weights, etc. But I wouldn't say there's a single underrated exercise that would make all the difference. So just keep training, keep balanced, and work on your weaknesses. Next question: what type of ODA were you on? Mountain, dive, etc. At 10th group, I did a very short stint on a mountain team for a deployment. I went over to Africa. When I first showed up, I was the only 18 Delta that showed up in the new guys in the company. And the 18 Delta on the mountain team was coming back for mountain warfare school. So they needed an 18 Delta over there. So I went and replaced him. And I did like 3 months over in Africa to finish out that deployment. But then I came back and my sergeant major had other plans for me. So he put me on the B team for a little bit. And I kind of got to know, usually they don't put new guys on the B team, but this guy, I'm not going to talk really much about him, but he kind of did things backwards. So the B team was a lot of new guys, and B teams are supposed to be older, experienced guys who have been around the block a few times. But either way, it kind of was beneficial because although I liked that mountain team a lot, I just wasn't super interested in doing a bunch of mountaineering. And at 10th group, if you're on a mountaineering team, like that is the mountaineering group, because obviously you're in the Rockies and you do a lot of mountain training, which is cool, but I just personally wasn't super into it. So I did a little bit on the B team and got to know the other teams in the company and ended up really taking a liking to the guys on the free fall team. And a new sergeant major came in and he sort of gave me an option, like, what team do you want to go to? And I chose the free fall team, went to free fall school, and the rest was kind of history. Stayed on that team until I PCS to go to OTC. Obviously OTC didn't work out, and went to third group. And third group, I started on the B team for a little while, and because we actually had the opposite problem, we had tons and tons of deltas for a little while. I was one of 3 deltas on the B team. So was there for, I don't remember exactly how long, probably about half a year, maybe 7 months or so. And then I went to a dive team at third group, and I was on the way third group does it. Not every group is like this, but the way third group does it is there's like a primary dive team in each battalion, and each company has a dive team technically, but we were not the first string dive team. So we were more of a maritime team. I think I only had like 4 divers on my team for the most part. The rest of the guys were not dive qualified. And so we did a lot of on the water operations, lots of riding in Zodiacs, lots of VBSS, basically boat interdictions, things like that, down in Key West and some other places as well, which was super cool. But I really like both teams a lot. And I think if you can get on a dive team, if you're interested in going to dive school, no one's going to fight you for it. You're absolutely going to be able to go. Dive school is probably the hardest school in SOF to pass and the most stressful school, but it also it makes you look really good on, you walk around with a dive bubble on. I'm not a diver, but I am a dive medic, which is totally different. Like dive medicine school is dive medical technician school is not nowhere near as difficult as dive school, but you do need a dive medic on the team. Either way, if you want to go to dive school, that's showing initiative and you'll be more respected, especially if you go and you pass. Free fall teams, usually new guys don't end up on free fall teams unless it's a manning thing. They just need someone to go to that team. But I kind of lucked out. These days, it's not as common to start your career on a free fall team because everybody and their brother-in-law wants to be on free fall teams and go to free fall school because it's super fun. But yeah, I really liked it. And whatever team you go to, just put in your best work and show up every day and grind and show the team that you're the right person for the job. And you may be on different teams throughout your career. That's pretty normal. So I would say keep your options open and kind of go wherever they tell you. But regardless of where you go, it's a great experience and you're gonna have a great time. Next question: best exercises to build shoulder strength. Yeah, so most people, it depends. If you want to just purely build shoulder strength, then I would say overhead press, any sort of, usually a barbell overhead press, whether it's seated, standing, or even in a split Smith machine, would probably be the most loadable way to train your shoulders. But also most people, and I'm not even saying some people, I'm saying most people would be better off not doing barbell overhead presses. And I know that probably sounds like absolute blasphemy, and I'm not saying this just to be different, but I'm saying it based on experience. The barbell overhead press is a very technical lift and it requires a lot of mobility And it also requires you to put your ego to the side and build the technique and not add too much weight to the bar and not use too much body English, not arch the shit out of your lower back. And most people just aren't willing to do that. But because they've heard the barbell overhead press is such a great exercise, a lot of people call it like the upper body squat, which I think is kind of funny. But either way, a lot of people just do it regardless, even though it beats them up and even though their shoulders hurt for a day after or 2 days after, or they just constantly have nagging shoulder issues. A lot of people hurt their lower back. A lot of people hurt their neck doing overhead presses. So if the overhead press is a good movement for you and you take it seriously and you don't lift with a lot of ego and you have great overhead mobility and upper back mobility, etc., then I would do overhead presses with a barbell. If not, if you are probably 8 or 9 out of 10 lifters that doesn't have those prerequisites, you don't need to do barbell overhead presses to build shoulder strength. You can use dumbbells, you can use a machine, and that would be usually what I recommend for most people. And I would also recommend not doing it directly overhead. I would do a very high incline around 60 to 70 degrees. I would say 70 for most people. If your shoulders are really bad, closer to 60. Incline press with dumbbells are great for this because you can put your hands in whatever position you want. And I would keep them in a more semi-neutral position. So neutral would be palms directly facing each other. Prone would be as if you're holding a barbell, so the palms are facing the wall in front of you. Semi-neutral is right in between there. And that also will allow you to tuck your shoulders a little bit instead of flaring them out to the side, which a lot of people just naturally do. But if you have them tucked at anywhere between a 45 to 60-ish degree angle and that semi-neutral grip, it's usually a better position for shoulder health. And it's also just as, if not more effective at growing the shoulders. Allows you to stack your joints, have your elbow underneath your wrist at the bottom position. A lot of people will internally rotate. Their elbows will kind of go behind their wrist at the bottom, and that can be really rough on the shoulders. So well executed overhead presses or semi overhead presses would be the best shoulder strength exercise. That all being said, because most people favor push day over pull day, and most people do way more volume on pushing exercises, even if it's a chest movement, whether it's a push-up, dip, incline press, bench press, whatever it may be, also involve the front delts to a non-trivial degree. Most people do those so much, and they do pulling movements a lot less, that their push to pull ratio is way higher than it should be. And therefore they have overdeveloped front delts and underdeveloped. If you do a lot of pulling, if you do a lot of row work, especially for upper back, you're probably going to have very well developed rear delts from it. But most people kind of don't hit the side delts as much. So they have kind of imbalances in their shoulder. So if that's you, you want to focus on your lateral delts probably more than anything. I would say the average person should focus more on their lateral delts than their front delts and their rear delts. And that doesn't mean just do 2 or 3 sets of lateral raises at the end of a upper body day once a week. Usually you have to do a little bit more volume than that for lateral delts, side delts, and you can do them on any day. You can even do them on lower body days if you want at the end. And you definitely should do more than just standing lateral raises. There are many other exercises you can do for the lateral delts. I would do some cable variations where you have the cable higher, so you hit the lengthened position. I would also do some lateral raises where you are chest supported up against the bench, so you're not using a bunch of momentum and cheating. You can also do cable Y raises. Those are great as well. Face pulls are fine. Upright rows, if you can handle them, are great. Not everyone can, but if they don't bother you, you can do them with dumbbells, and it's usually a little bit more favorable on the shoulders than with barbells. But those are all good lateral delt exercises, and most people should focus mostly on those. But again, if you want to build brute shoulder strength, some sort of overhead press, I would just say for most people, the overhead press with a barbell standing version is not the best option for long-term shoulder health and longevity, even though that is like one of the big 5 exercises that everyone loves. And it's quote unquote the upper body squat. For me, it's not really one of the movements I use a lot for a lot of my clients, nor myself. Next question. How long did you walk for today, and how often, how much do you walk during a work week? Yeah, so if you didn't see my stories yesterday, the replies to these questions, I was walking for pretty much all of them. I did one walk in the morning, one in the evening. Yesterday was a rest day, so I usually walk a lot more on rest days than other days. And also because I was kind of multitasking, answering these questions and walking, I walked a little bit more than I usually do. So I had 21,000 steps yesterday. In the month of July, my average is a little over 16,000. And I would say for the year, I didn't look at the year, but I would say 14 to 15,000 steps a day. I usually walk in the morning. I walk the dogs soon after sunrise. I usually get a bunch of work done first thing before the sun comes up. And then around 8-ish, I take the dogs for a relatively long walk. This time of year, that's pretty much the only time that I can take dogs for a long walk because it's crazy, crazy hot in the afternoon. We do another walk in the afternoon normally, but it's much shorter. And sometimes I'll take the dogs for like 15 minutes and then I'll drop them off and then walk myself. A lot of my step count, though, is from running. Right now I'm averaging 18 to 25, sometimes 27 miles of running per week. So that accounts for lots of my steps as well. But on a given work day, I do at least one morning walk, and it's usually close to an hour, sometimes a little less, just depending on what I have going on. And then I also walk for 10, sometimes up to 30, 40 minutes after I lift as like my cool down and my opportunity to get some sunshine, like actual sunshine that's not for sleep purposes, like morning sunshine, but like actual sunshine on my skin. And also, if I'm not running in the afternoon, I'll do a walk in the afternoon, like before dinner. And then once in a while, if I'm super short on steps, like for me, if I'm under 12K, that's like a really low day for me and something I want to kind of make up. Once in a while, I will walk on my walking pad in the evening when my wife and I are watching TV. We have a little walking pad in the living room, and I'll hop on that for, 10, 15, 20 minutes or something like that. Just nice and slow, easy walks just to get my step count up. But I think walking is very underrated and more people should take walking seriously and do more walking. It's great for mental health. It's great for physical health. It's great for multitasking. You can go for a walk with someone and have great conversation. You can go for a walk with yourself and leave everything behind and just kind of clear your head. Nature and sunlight and movement are like cheat codes pretty much for mental health and creativity and mental clarity and taking a break throughout the day. You can put headphones on, bring your phone and listen to an audiobook, or you can listen to a podcast if you want. You can even listen to music. I personally like to do a lot of those things. I usually listen to music only when I lift, but I'll listen to an audiobook or a podcast, or I'll walk with my wife and we'll talk. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. If you have freaking dogs and you don't walk your dogs, then you are not a good dog owner. You don't deserve to be a good dog owner. That is pet abuse. It's animal abuse to literally take the one thing away from your dogs that they live for and decide not to do that because you're lazy. So if you're a dog owner and you don't walk them, hopefully that this hits home and you take your dogs out for walks, because literally that's the only thing they care about minus eating and sleeping. Dogs live to exercise, and this gets me really, really, really worked up because I cannot imagine owning a dog and not walking it. So that's another way. That's another reason I like to walk, because I have dogs and I am not a dog abuser. No question. Just saying, I appreciate all the information you give out here and on the pods. Thanks, man. Appreciate you guys listening in. I'm happy to do my best to help you guys out and give you guys the answers to the best of my ability. So appreciate it. Next question. Thoughts on rowing to improve cardio overall? Rowing's great. Really, any form of cardio is awesome if you like rowing. I also like rowing. It's one of my favorite ways to get a cardio session in. It's great. You can do long rows, you can do intervals, you can do multiple different things on a rower. I would say most people just don't really take rowing seriously, and they just don't spend any time learning form or practicing form. You can usually get away with sitting on a rower and just not caring about form, but you look like a goober, and also it's just less effective. And although it's not as injury producing as running, people absolutely can get hurt on rowers. And if you lock your form in, not only are you going to be a lot better on the rower, you're also going to not look like an idiot. And also you are less likely to hurt yourself. So take a little bit of time. Doesn't really take all that much to learn the proper sequence of rowing and to do some practicing of it and lock that in so it's muscle memory. And rowing is just going to be a lot better for you, and you're going to enjoy it more, and you're going to be better at it, which is always fun. You can progress more. Next question, process to refine and find why statement for soft selection and after, or the process you used. Yeah, so I think you're overthinking this a little bit. People think that they need this like perfect why, that they're going to get tested on it or something. You might get asked what your why is at some point, but your why could be really whatever you want it to be. Everyone's going to have a different why. You don't really have to go through a process. You don't have to like think about all these things. If you can't find a reason why, forcing yourself to find a reason why probably indicates that it may not be a good choice for you. The why should be at least like relatively simple. Like it should come to you. You should have like a very strong desire to go and do it. And it doesn't have to be like anyone else's why. You don't have to go through a process for it, but you should have a deep down reason, desire, whatever it may be, to be doing it, because a lot of parts of it really suck, and they suck even more if you have no reason to be there. So if your why is not strong enough, then there's no freaking reason to do it, because otherwise it's just freaking miserable. So whatever you want to do, whatever your reason for it is, don't feel like you have to go through a process and come up with this perfect statement or paragraph or whatever. It could just be like, I want to go do cool things, or I want to go and test myself and see what I'm made of, or I have spent most of my life doing easy shit and I want to go do something hard, or I want to go and serve with some of the best like-minded people in the world and go make a difference in the country. Whatever it is, it could be something simple like that. It does not have to be that elaborate. You don't have to sit down and do some crazy like process for it. I don't think I really sat down and put much thought into it. I just wanted to go and do it and prove to myself that I'm not a piece of shit. And so I went and did it. So it doesn't have to be super elaborate. Don't have to overthink it. Next question, hardcore addicted to caffeine. Will this hinder me at SFAS? Yeah, so it might hinder you depending on how hardcore it is. If you're hardcore addicted to it, that probably means you basically live off of it. You have lots of caffeine every single day. And when you stop using caffeine, which you're going to have to do at SFAS, you might be able to use the little coffee packets in the MREs, but that's not nearly enough caffeine, especially if you're hardcore addicted to it. You're still going to have withdrawals if you don't taper it or quit it before you go. This is something I talk about in my recovery guide, something I talk about with my clients. When you are approaching selection, you want to either taper your caffeine or you want to just quit cold turkey. But I wouldn't quit cold turkey like a couple days out. I would do it well before, maybe like when your taper starts, since you're not really going to be training all that hard. Plus or minus 11 days of no caffeine is enough to completely resensitize yourself to caffeine. So what that means is if you're caffeine free for 11 days, when you start using caffeine again, you're going to feel the effects of it, like completely resensitized, give or take. It could be a little bit different for everyone. Probably depends on how much you're using. It depends on some other things about like how you metabolize caffeine and whatnot, but about that. So I would just say shoot for 2 weeks. So like, either way, whether you go cold turkey, usually if you're hardcore addicted to it, going cold turkey will be pretty rough, like really rough for a few days, kind of rough for a few days after that, and then should start feeling a little bit better. But for some people, tapering is not really an option. They just end up overdoing it and they never really quit. Tapering usually would be, say you're averaging 500 milligrams of caffeine per day, which isn't that hardcore addicted. That's not too bad. I usually like to cap people off at 400 if at all possible. If you're consuming 500 a day, you can go down to 400 for a few days. You can go down to 300 for a few days. You can go down to 200 for a few days. You can go down to 100 for a few days. Usually when you're down to that 100 for a few days, you can go off completely and maybe have one day where you're withdrawing a little bit, but shouldn't be too bad. But you could also just stop and suck it up for a few days. And everyone's a little different in their withdrawal symptoms from caffeine. Some people, it's pretty mild and very manageable. Some people, it is really, really freaking miserable. And if you are really addicted to it and you have lots of it, the chances of your withdrawal symptoms being more intense is a little bit higher. So why would you want to stop? Because during the first week, that is the most important week for you to perform your physical events as best you can. It's gate week. So you want to be as fast as possible under a ruck. You want to be as fast as possible rucking. And you're also sitting in a classroom all day. So you want to be able to listen and actually think and things like that. So if you're also going through caffeine withdrawals at that same time, It's just going to be a way more miserable week for you, and it will impede performance for sure. Will it be like crazy measurable and, take you from a 35-minute 5 mile to a 41-minute 5 mile? Most likely not. But it will make your life more miserable, and it won't be ideal for your performance in week 1. So I highly suggest getting off it before you go. Another bonus to doing that is if you do get the chance to use the caffeine in the MRE pouches, you can use that strategically if you're resensitized to it. So say you haven't used caffeine for 2 weeks before going, and you go to selection and you have a 12-mile rep coming up and you're resensitized to caffeine. Caffeine has positive benefits on aerobic fitness when used strategically and when you're not sensitive to it, or when you are sensitive to it. And when you potentially use it after resensitizing yourself, you can benefit from it on the rucks. Maybe you save 2 or 3 caffeine packets and use it strategically throughout the first week. So that would be my recommendation. Highly suggest not just going into selection on 700 milligrams of caffeine a day and then you have to stop and you're just gonna be miserable. So definitely be smart about that and show up not addicted to caffeine. Next question, how much lean muscle can someone add naturally per month on a hypertrophy block? So 1 month is a very small time frame unless you are brand new to lifting. If you're brand new to lifting, beginner, within your first 6 months ish of training and you're doing things right and you are eating in a calorie surplus, this is going to apply to whatever your experience level is. It's not as important for a beginner, but if assuming the beginner is eating in a calorie surplus and they're doing things right, probably a pound or 2 per month would be a solid rate of gain. That is assuming also that the person has like decent genetics. You can gain up to 20-ish pounds of muscle in your first year of lifting if you're doing things really well. Some people even more than that if they have really good genetics and they train sound. Their training is very sound. For intermediate, probably half a pound of muscle would be a really good month. 3/4 would be a bomb month. Most people aren't going to get much higher than that, even if things are going really well. Intermediate, usually anywhere between a year and a half to however many. Intermediates can stay intermediates for a really long time. Most people are always intermediates. They're never going to be advanced trainees. You have to like really take it seriously and really be a student of training to become a advanced lifter. And it also has to do with not just how long you've been lifting, but how long you've been lifting in a way that is actually like most beneficial. Like how long have you been following a quality training plan? Additionally, it also has to do with your muscle development. Some people can lift for 10 years and they don't even look like they lift. Other people can lift for 2 years and they look like they've been lifting for 10 years. So all those things, there's no one who's like perfect intermediate, perfect beginner. I guess you could be a perfect beginner, but after intermediate stage, some people have like advanced qualities and some intermediate qualities and things like that. So there's a lot of gray area. But for an advanced lifter, if an advanced lifter put on 1 to 2 pounds of muscle in 1 year naturally, they would be very, very excited, very happy with that. So what is that per month? I don't know, 0.1 to 0.2, something like that. Probably not the right math, but either way, very minimal. You're not going to really see any differences as a beginner or an advanced lifter in 1 month. So that would be what I would expect, just depending on how well you do things or how poorly you do things, and also your training age and your absolute age. Next question, do you do direct ab work or do you do full body movement for ab work involvement? So I go on and off the wagon with ab work. I personally have solid abs regardless of whether I train them or not. They're not like, I don't have great ab genetics and they don't pop out even if I don't train them like some people. That is the case for some people, but I'm always lean enough to see them. And if I train them a little bit more, you can kind of see a little bit, you can see them pop out a little bit more. And I've been training them recently. Probably the last 2 to 3 months, I've been doing 6 or 7, maybe 8 sets of ab work per week, just like I would train any other body part. And that's the important thing with ab work is most people just think the abs are some magic muscle that responds to super high reps or whatever it may be. The abs are just like any other body part. If you want to make them bigger, if you want to increase the size of your abdominal muscles, you have to train them in a hypertrophy rep range. You have to take them close to failure. You have to train them with some sort of reasonable volume, whether anywhere between, I would say 6 and 15 sets or so per week. You probably don't need 15 unless you have like weird ab goals. But That's the thing about ab training. Additionally, in order to see your abs, you have to be lean. If you have bigger, more muscular abs, you'll be able to see them at slightly higher body fat percentages. So that does not mean like if you have big abs, you'll be able to see your abs at 20%. It may be instead of if your abs aren't very muscular, you might be able to see them at 9 or 10%, like really see them, like actually have a six pack. Whereas if you have big muscular abs because you train them, it might be 11 or 12%, something like that. So it's not that huge of a difference, but I do think that it makes sense to train abs. I personally just kind of get lazy with them sometimes, and I go several months without training them, but I've been on an ab training kick lately, and that's what I've been doing. In regards to using full body exercises like compound lifts to build your abs, they're not really going to make your abs bigger. They will improve your core strength, and you can be totally fine. You can have a strong enough core to do everyday life without training abs from doing plenty of compound lifts. But I still think that doing a little bit of direct core work would probably be good, even if you don't care about making them bigger. And that could look like many different things. You can do certain carries. You can do plank variations, side plank variations. You can do cable work, cable chops, twists, things like that. You can do explosive stuff like medicine ball, half kneeling, medicine ball, lateral throws, things like that for like power, like core power. But yeah, I think training abs is a good idea, but at the same time, it's nothing magic and you don't need to like reinvent the wheel with your ab training. It can be very, very simple. And another thing, like make sure you're training your abs and not your hip flexors. Like there's a specific way of training your abs that isn't hip flexors. You want to think, bring your pelvis to the bottom of your rib cage or your bottom of your rib cage to your pelvis. That's how you train abs. You don't do all these flutter kicks. You don't do all these hanging leg raises, except all you're using is your hip flexors. A lot of people train abs and all they're doing is getting hip flexor pump. And, I guess it works the abs a little bit, but it's nowhere near as effective as actually thinking about the range of motion for the abs, lengthening, shortening, just like any other muscle group. So I hate training abs. I'm not a huge fan of it at all, but I've been doing it a little bit and yeah, is what it is. Next question, thoughts on combining zone 2 and zone 3 runs? For example, 20 minutes in zone 2, 20 minutes in zone 3 for a 40-minute run. Is it beneficial? Using it this way, not necessarily, unless you're doing some sort of like tempo finish. If you are starting with an easy run and you want to finish with a tempo effort, then going zone 2 for most of it and then finishing with a tempo portion, which would be like high zone 3, low zone 4. That would be not something I would do all the time, but it is something that can be beneficial. In phase 2 of my 2 and 5 mile run program, I have a similar setup to this. It doesn't finish with tempo and you're just done. You go back into a slow finish to kind of cool down, but kind of similar. What I think he is asking though is, should I start in zone 2 and then just creep into zone 3 at the end? Would that be beneficial? No. If anything, it would be more detrimental than just staying in zone 2. Creeping into zone 3 once in a while, like throughout the run, and then kind of dialing it back, and then creeping into zone 3 and then dialing it back. Or if it's crazy, crazy hot out, you last 5 minutes of your run, you happen to be, getting into zone 3. Still not ideal, but doing it intentionally, just like kind of creeping into zone 3 for the last half of your run, very, very minimally beneficial. And if anything, it's just going to be more difficult for you to recover from that run, and you're not going to really get any additional aerobic benefits. So zone 3, zone 4 training, when you're kind of doing threshold work, great. Also not something to do all the time, but great to do like weekly. But just kind of creeping into zone 3 is really not going to get you anywhere. And if anything, it's just going to be a little bit detrimental for recovery, assuming you're doing plenty of running. If that's your only run per week, then it really doesn't matter. You can do the whole thing in zone 3. But if you are trying to get better at running and you're doing consistent running and you have decently high mileage, then just being in low zone 3 is kind of not very beneficial. Next question, how to be the most valuable asset you can be as the fucking new guy, FNG. Yeah, so I made a post about this a while back, but I definitely will retouch on it. It was probably close to a year ago. So the new guy on a soft team. I'll speak specifically for Green Berets, but I'm sure this applies to other soft units. Also, it probably applies to some workforces Probably not to quite the extent of Green Berets, but it probably does apply. So these are probably good things to consider regardless of whether you're going into SOF or not. So as an SF guy, the number one thing beyond anything else, you show up very fucking fit. You want to show up and try and be the fittest dude in your team. If you're not like competing with the fittest dudes on the team, then you messed up. And this is especially the case for an X-ray because you really don't have much else to bring to the table. So if you show up as an X-ray unfit, you are starting yourself off with a terrible reputation, and reputation is everything in SF. So if you're known as that new guy who's an X-ray and doesn't really know how to do his job and really is behind the power curve and you're not in shape, then your reputation is starting off not where you want it to. So show up in shape. You have 6 months of language school before you go to group. 6 months of sitting in a classroom from, I think it's like 9 to 3, maybe 9 to 4, something like that. You should absolutely have plenty of time to train, and you will have plenty of time to train. But some people don't take advantage of that, or they do train, but they go on PEDs or SARMs or whatever crazy shit they sell at Steers in Fayetteville. I don't know if that place still exists, but either way, this is kind of the case when I went through. And they get crazy, crazy jacked and super duper strong, but they can't run and they can't really do anything other than look jacked. So don't do that. You're going to a unit that requires certain physical standards and not just looking jacked. Looking jacked is like way down the list of what is required to be a fit and capable Green Beret. So show up in as good a shape as you possibly can, and there's no excuse for not doing that. Absolutely no excuse. The first thing I ever looked at with a new guy was how fit they were. I really didn't care about their competence with their job because I wouldn't expect them to be super confident. You get trained on your MOS in the Q course, but they don't train you like how to do it on a team. So that is just going to take some time to learn. But if someone's not disciplined enough to show up fit, then that is saying all that needs to be said about that person, unless they light a fire under their ass and fix themselves. So that's number one. Number two is speak when spoken to. Try not to do a bunch of talking when you're not spoken to at first. You should lean towards being a man of few words, but that doesn't mean don't talk at all and doesn't mean be super weird. You absolutely should be conversational. And if someone asks you questions, don't just give them one word answers. Like actually be a normal human that knows how to have conversations and don't be like, yeah, no. Like just have a conversation. That being said, you don't want to take that too far and be the guy who's always talking as the new guy. Depending on the team you show up to, some teams might not even let you talk unless you're spoken to at all. Other teams aren't like that. My team was never like that, but I have heard like certain teams are like that until you kind of prove yourself. Whether you are going to a dive team and you go to dive school, you can't talk till you have your dive bubble, or you can't talk until you do, certain things on the team and prove yourself. So that's kind of situation dependent, but be a man of few words, but also don't be a freaking robot and say nothing. Ask lots of questions. You want to ask questions. Even if you're senior and even if the rest of the team makes fun of you or says your questions are stupid, keep asking them, because eventually if you don't keep asking them, you're going to have a question that really, really freaking needed to be asked. And you're not going to ask it because you're afraid you'll get made fun of. And it could be a very minor problem or it could be a very catastrophic problem. So ask your freaking questions, even if you think they're dumb. You're not expected to know everything. So even though some guys will treat new guys they'll haze them a little bit, or they'll give them shit all the time, or they'll say your questions are dumb, whatever, they still are happy to answer them. Deep down, they want to help you and they want you to get better, because that's really the only way to do it, is ask questions. But when that fails, figure it out. Figure it the fuck out. FitFo. There will be a lot of times in your career, there will be a lot of things that you run into where you just don't have the resources. You don't have someone to ask, or you do have someone to ask, but they don't know, or they can't give you the answer, or whatever it may be. Sometimes you're just going to have to figure stuff out. You're going to have to try something and you're probably going to fail it. And then you can try something else and then you're probably going to fail it. But eventually you're going to figure it out. And this is a very good life skill as well. FitFo. Figuring things out. The more you try things, the better you're going to get at them. So take action and don't just kind of like wait until you have the perfect conditions and just then try to do it, because the perfect conditions are never going to come. So get really good at trying things and failing and not getting too mad at yourself about failing, and get really good at figuring stuff out when you don't have the resources and you don't have the logistics and you have no idea what you're doing. Guess what? You're going to still be expected to do things, and you're also going to be expected to do things at a very high level. And the more times you can fail little things and figure things out, the more skill you're going to end up developing, and the better you're going to get at bouncing back from messing things up and still figuring things out. You're also going to reduce the fear that people naturally have trying things out. If you try things all the time and sometimes you fail, it's just like another thing. Think about it like talking to girls in the bar. Say you go to the bars every weekend and you only go and talk to one girl per month, and most of the time you just get rejected and denied. You're probably not going to want to go talk to a lot of girls, because your ratio, your success ratio is so low, and you just don't have the confidence to go try again. But say you go to the bar every weekend and you talk to 15 girls every single night. Probably there's going to be one, maybe two, unless you're a fucking weirdo and I don't know, like really messed up or creepy. There's probably going to be one or two that at least like talk back to you and have a conversation with you. You may not bring them home and marry them eventually, but the more you do it, the less of an issue it's going to be. And you're not even going to have any fear or apprehension to go and talk to these girls anymore, because you know what it feels like to fail, and you know what it feels like to get rejected and fuck up. Same thing with figuring it out. Figure shit out. If you fail it, no big deal. The more often you try it, obviously there's certain things where, you want to not just send it, and, definitely exercise some critical thinking skills, which is another one as a new guy. Be a good critical thinker and problem solver. But there are lots of things where you can just try it. And if it doesn't work, you try something else. That doesn't work, you try something else. Don't try the same exact thing every single time. Like, learn from your failures and try a different route, but whatever it may be. But that's going to be huge. Another thing is never just sit idly. There will be times where the team is kind of sitting around and bullshitting, and you can be part of that for sure. But if other people are working and you're not, then you're fucked up, even if it's a different MOS. Usually the Bravos and the Charlies are most busy. They have the most shit to do. So if you're a Delta or an Echo, then you probably could help the Charlies with something, or the Bravos with something. I was a Delta. The Deltas have the least to do on an average day in the team room. They just do. We don't have a lot to do. Unless something goes bad, like Deltas are doing S1 shit, but it's really not like super time or resource intensive. So the great thing about that is you can go and work with the Charlies or the Bravos, and you can learn shit about weapons. You can learn shit about planning ranges. You can learn shit about putting requests in, things like that. With the Charlies, you can learn things about engineer. You can learn stuff about being a car mechanic. You can learn stuff about getting vehicles ready, things like that. So always, when you're a new guy, don't be just sitting there and watching other people work. Definitely find a bullshit. But if other people are not idle, you shouldn't be idle. There is, even if everyone's done, and even if none of those guys need help, there's always a bathroom to clean. There's always a floor to sweep or vacuum. There are always desks to dust. There's always trash to take out, whatever it may be. Don't be that guy who shows up new and does not keep the team room nice and tidy. Just don't even wait to be asked for it. Just do it. No one's going to be like, dude, why the fuck are you cleaning the team room? Like, just go do it. Everyone will appreciate that. And it'll show that you are the new guy and you understand that you're the new guy and that you are a contributing member to the team. And the last thing, make sure you bring some beer. Show up with some beer. I personally would recommend either asking your senior if you have a senior, ask what the team drinks. Generally, teams will have one or two different types of beer that they drink. Like, the team sergeant might drink Miller Lite and the senior Bravo might drink Yingling or something like that. You're usually better off showing up with no beer than bringing beer that everyone hates. So try and either ask your senior or check the team room fridge or something like that. Ask the B team what the team drinks and show up with a case of beer. I would do that. at least for the first month, maybe every week, bring a case of beer in, something like that. That's just a thing. I don't know. Like, I personally never really cared whether new guys brought beer in or not. Back in my drinking days, I definitely didn't care later on in my career when I stopped drinking, but definitely bring beer in. Even if you don't drink, just bring beer in. And that is just basically expected of you. So don't be the guy who shows up empty-handed. And if none of your team drinks, then bring in some nicotine or Monsters or something like that. Most teams are going to have at least some drinkers on it. I highly doubt there's a single ODA that has no beer drinkers on it. But I guess if that hypothetical situation ever comes up, then just bring something else in. Next question, do you have a program for Ranger School? Nope, I do not. And although I never really thought I would be making a Ranger School prep program, because I am not really a believer that the Ranger School standards are that hard to meet, and you only have to meet them for the first few days. And then after that, you're just slugging along in the woods with a rucksack on. Obviously, you have to pass your patrols, but you don't have to do anything physical after like day 4, the 12-mile ruck. Although I believe that you should be able to show up to Ranger School in the drop of a dime if you're a tactical athlete that takes their job seriously and maintains their fitness with good, solid year-round training. Lots of people have been asking me about Ranger School programs. So at some point, because of the demand, I might make one. But if you're a tactical athlete and you have some sort of job that is fitness related, whether you're an infantryman, absolutely, if you're in SOF, whatever it may be, and you don't feel like you could pass Ranger School next week, then something needs to be fixed in your training. You need to improve your well-roundedness as a tactical athlete because, again, it's not really that hard. You have to run sub 40-minute 5-mile. You have to do 6 chin-ups. You have to do 49 push-ups. At least that was the old test. It might be a little different, but I can't see it being all that much more difficult. You have to be able to ruck 12 miles under 3 hours with 35 pounds dry. It's probably going to end up weighing in the low 40s with water and all that stuff, maybe 45, but it's not difficult. You should be able to meet those standards year round on the drop of a dime as a tactical athlete, in my opinion. So Ranger School program may happen eventually, but just take those words to heart if you don't think you could pass Ranger School next week if you were told you were going. Next question is 220 minus age, which is 39, times 0.7 for zone 2 accurate if my max heart rate on an ACFT was 209 using a chest strap. Yeah, so I answered this question wrong. I didn't see the chest strap part, or I didn't acknowledge the chest strap part in the question. And I said, don't trust your watch readings for higher heart rate for higher intensity stuff because it's not accurate. But if it was a chest strap, this guy might be an outlier. His heart rate might be higher than what is supposed to be at his age. Usually a very rudimentary way to calculate your approximate max heart rate is 220 minus age. But like I said, very rudimentary. There's lots of people that won't be applicable to. So if you had a chest strap on, you got up to 209, I would consider that to be close to your max heart rate. I'm assuming this is probably like the end of a run where you just went really hard, the end of the 2 mile. So I would use that as your max heart rate calculation. And then 0.7, he's referring to like zone 2. Usually zone 2, depending on where you look, is going to be somewhere between the 0.6 to 0.7 range, sometimes 0.65 to 0.75 times your max heart rate, 65 to 75% of your max heart rate or whatever. So that is the reference there. That is also a little bit rudimentary. And if you're trying to stick to a single heart rate the entire time on a run, you're going to absolutely have a miserable time. Heart rate should be in zones. So if anything, I would use that max heart rate of 209 and find a zone, again, somewhere between 0.6 and 0.7 or 0.65, 0.75, somewhere around there, and use that for your zone 2 heart rate range. However, for most people, unless you're a very, very serious runner and you have big running goals, you don't necessarily need to even worry about heart rate all that much for zone 2. If you can have a conversation, if you can breathe through your nose, if you can say 10 to 12 words probably at a time, maybe 12 to 15 words at a time without having to stop for a breath or without having to take like this big gasp for air afterwards, like a recovery breath. And you generally not lie to yourself and say, this is a relatively easy run, RPE 4, maybe 5. If it's a longer run, maybe 5.5, 6 towards the end, then you're probably totally fine. Whether you're technically in low zone 3 or if you're in mid zone 2 or if you're in high zone 2, low zone 2, whatever it may be, doesn't really matter all that much unless you have big running goals, you run lots and lots of miles, and recovery is like a big priority. And like going too hard with too many of your runs could potentially put you kind of in a recovery hole. But for most people, heart rate's fine, but it's just a proxy. And lots of other factors can affect your heart rate. The temperature, your stimulant use, your hydration, whether you drank beer the night before, your sleep the night before, your stress levels, lots and lots and lots of different things can affect your heart rate up or down. And when you get too wrapped around the axle with heart rate, especially for zone 2 running, usually it's just paralysis by analysis, and it doesn't really help you all that much. Instead, I would just go out and make sure you're running easy. You can do the talk test, you can do breathe through your nose, whatever it may be. And honestly, a combo of those things is probably the best approach, and you should be totally fine. Next question, would doing hill sprints in kit have any real value, or would you be better off doing them unweighted? If you're going to do sprints or running in kit, honestly, doing them on a hill would probably be the best way to do it because of the reduction in impact from the hill, which I basically talk about every episode. But for those who are new, when you run uphill, it's going to be lower impact. It's going to slow you down naturally. It's going to make running more difficult, but it's also going to be easier to recover from because it's not going to be as rough on your joints and connective tissue. So running uphill, especially if you're not a seasoned sprinter, is a really good idea. Doing it in kit, is it necessary? Probably not. There are multiple different ways to make running more difficult and increase the challenge of running and therefore potentially improve your results. One kind of category of ways is to change the surface that you're running on, whether you're running uphill, whether you're running on a curve runner that's a little bit more difficult. It's almost like running up a slight incline. You can run through sand, run through loose sand. That definitely makes running more difficult. It's not great for like developing good run technique and run form. I guess if you're training for buds, you definitely want to do some sand running if you can. But all those will make running more difficult. Another category is to add resistance that pulls you backwards. So this could be attaching a sled to your waist, or it could be even doing sled sprints where you're pushing the sled, really light sled, so you can get into a full sprint and it's not like crazy heavy strength stimulus. It's more of a sprint speed stimulus. You can attach a parachute to you. A lot of people run, a lot of high level athletes, some non-high level athletes who think they're high level athletes will use a parachute and do sprints with that. And that'll slow you down also and kind of improve your power, but also reduce your risk of injury when you do it right, because you're just not hitting that top speed like you would doing a regular flat sprint. You can drag a tire, whatever it may be. And then finally, you can add weight to your frame to make running more difficult. However, when you add weight to your frame, whether it's a ruck, kit, weight vest, whatever it is, you are also increasing the injury risk because you're adding however many pounds of weight to your body that's already a certain weight, and you have to deal with that as well. So that's going to increase impact exponentially. Usually, depending on your running skill, every time you come down on one step during a run, it's going to be somewhere between 1.5 times for a really, really, really good, technically sound runner to 4 to 5 times your body weight to like a ground punisher, someone who absolutely hates the ground and they just slam into it and big heel strike, super long strides. And usually those people are very injury prone in running. So you add 25-pound kit to that, 30-pound ruck, 40-pound ruck, whatever it may be. Yes, it's making it harder, but it's also increasing the impact. So it's therefore likely increasing the injury risk of that. However, in this case, since you are doing it on a hill, again, the hill will kind of balance out the impact, the otherwise impact increasing effects of wearing extra weight. So if you were going to do sprints, you can do sprints in kit on flat, like if you're training for whatever once in a while, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it all the time. But if you are going to do sprints, I think the hill would make it hard enough personally to get a really good stimulus and a really good session from it. I don't think adding the extra weight of your kit is necessary in most cases, unless you have a very specific reason for it. But if you're going to do it, you should do it on a hill. It would be better than doing flat sprints or doing really long, especially better than doing really long runs in kit. And this is coming from someone who used to do kit running all the time before I knew any better. And it's just usually not worth it. So I would take that information for what it's worth and go from there. Next question, is a 300-ish squat necessary for success at SFAS? No, you don't even have to squat for SFAS. Boom. I said it. I've said this before, but you don't have to do barbell squats or front squats, back squats, whatever, for SFAS. You should absolutely do some sort of squat movement, but you don't have to have a certain number on the bar and back squat it or front squat it or anything. Is the squat a great movement? Yeah, but it is not necessary for SFAS. The only things that are necessary, standards that are necessary for SFAS, are things you're going to be tested on there. Your run times, your ruck times, your calisthenic numbers. You're going to get tested on not a specific test, but you're going to have times where your grip strength and grip endurance is very important. So those are the main things you want to focus on. You should absolutely shoot to be strong in the gym, but you don't have to have a 300-pound squat. I personally didn't have anywhere near a 300-pound squat when I went. I probably was squatting 225-ish for maybe 3 or 4 reps at the most, and it was kind of ugly. Well, after I finished SFAS and went through the Q course, my squat went way up because I actually took it more seriously. But I did totally fine at SFAS, and I was not that strong. So whenever you see numbers like this, especially if it's a number on a barbell lift or a number that isn't tested on at selection, yes, those are good proxies for strength, but you don't necessarily have to. You could train for SFAS without ever touching a barbell and still fucking crush. You could literally be the top guy in the class and you don't have to touch a barbell at all once in your selection prep. There are plenty of other ways. It's 2024, so there are plenty of other ways to get strong. You can use machines, you can use dumbbells, you can use specialty bars, you can use body weight, you can do like weighted body weight exercises. It does not have to occur with a barbell. It can. You absolutely can use a barbell if barbells work really well for you and you're built really well for barbell training, and or you don't have access to other equipment. Barbells are super versatile. They can build lots of strength, but are they necessary? No. And is a 300-ish pound squat necessary for selection success? Absolutely not. It's just not. So best of luck to you. Next question, tempo/intervals in heat, high dew point. Better to reduce volume or intensity if you must pick. So the best option for speed work in hot weather is usually to do it inside on a treadmill. The main reason for this is when you do speed work, you want to focus mostly on speed adaptations most of the time. You can occasionally do them outside in the heat, especially if you're training for an event that occurs in the heat. But by doing them in hot weather, you're going to lose out on speed adaptations. You're going to get some heat adaptations, but there's a trade-off there. There's no free lunches. So what I would do is do most of your, this is the optimal plan. This would be the optimal approach. I would do most of your speed work this time of year when it's super hot, high dew point, indoors. And I would do most of your slower, easier stuff that is longer duration where pace and speed does not matter as much outdoors. That way you get the heat adaptations, but on your speed days, you get the speed adaptations and you get kind of the best of both worlds. You can also implement a little bit of sauna work if you really need to acclimate, just reasonable amounts of it, but that would be the optimal approach. If you're not going to do that and you're just going to do it outside, that's fine. Not a huge deal. I do all my speed work outside and I'm not even training for anything. I just don't like to do speed work at the gym. So I totally get it. But also because I'm not training for anything, I don't mind having to go slower and I don't mind adjusting my speed workouts accordingly to make them more doable, but also they're going to be less effective for speed adaptations. I could get faster if I did some of them indoors, but there's multiple different ways you can do this. You can reduce the volume, you can reduce the speed a little bit, you can reduce the intensity, you can increase the rest periods. You could also, if you're doing like tempo work, instead of just doing a long tempo run for a certain amount of time, you can break it into tempo intervals where you rest in between. So say, for example, instead of doing a 24-minute tempo run, you could do 3 by 8-minute tempo portions. And in between those tempo portions, you slow down to a jog or even a walk. You get complete walking rest or just a really easy recovery jog. And that way you're going to be able to hit that tempo pace easier. But because the fatigue that you're getting on those intervals or on that tempo run, if you were to do the whole 24-minute tempo run, the fatigue, a lot of that would be from the heat, not necessarily your inability to run that fast in ideal conditions, if that makes sense. So basically the heat just artificially almost adds fatigue to it, not because you're not fit enough to do it, but really the only option there is to slow down a little, which you lose out on speed adaptations, or to cut them into intervals where you get a little bit of rest in between. And that way you're able to hit that tempo pace a lot easier. on your tempo portions. So you still spend the same amount of time at that pace. So you still get that pace adaptation, but because you're resting in between, it's less fatiguing and it's not like a 9.9 RPE. Because a lot of people will just send it with the 24-minute tempo run. And because it's so hot, that tempo run is going to be a 9.7, 9.9 RPE instead of what a tempo run should be, which should be like 7 to 8. And it's way more fatiguing and more of a recovery burden. And you don't really get the adaptation you were looking for because you just did it anyway in the heat and it smoked you. For intervals, sometimes you might have to cut intervals short. You might have to do fewer of them. You might have to rest longer than usual. In some cases, depending on where you're doing intervals, if you can get in the shade for a rest break, that would be ideal. Or bring some really cold water with you and just pour it on your neck, on your forearms, in between rounds, and try and cool yourself off a little bit more. You can slow down, but that would not be my first choice because you're still going for those speed adaptations. I would rather see someone, if they're supposed to do 12 intervals at a certain pace, but if they did 12, their pace would drop off dramatically in the last few. I'd rather them do 8 intervals, but maintain that pace, or do 12 intervals, but rest longer in between each one, then slow down. So that would be my way to go about it. Again, probably going inside would be optimal, but I understand some people aren't going to do that because I'm one of them. And so you definitely should make some sort of other adjustment, whether it's volume or rest periods or cutting certain workouts that are supposed to be a certain time down into chunks. And that should work best for you. We'll wrap it up there, guys. That's a pretty long episode and got to some really good questions. But yeah, we're going to call it a day. Thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you guys for the great questions. And I'll be back soon with another episode. Till then, Terminator out.